Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don DeRay. I'm from Consensus Technologies, and we're the sponsor of the room today. Just have a brief minute to talk about my company. We're located up in Cranberry Township. If anybody knows where that is, not too far from here. We provide hardware, software, service, and support for organizations of all sizes. I'm not going to take a lot of time because I know everybody has short presentations today. So that's all I'm going to say about the company, but we do have some information in the back of the room if you guys would like to stop back and say hi to us. Right now, I'd like to introduce Sandy Sears from RG.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm not sure I've ever presented anything in 18 minutes or less, so this will be a first for me. And I'm sure it'll be memorable for me, at least. Excuse me. I also want to apologize for the gray text on the slides. You may appear to be seeing some slides that look blank. The good news about that, from my perspective, is if I read you the slide, you won't know I've done it. That was a joke. And today I'm going to talk about big data, big risk or big reward. And this topic is triggered by a lot that's going on currently, and you've been reading about it a lot in the press. I'm sure you're aware of the Equifax breach. The original estimations were 143,000 or million people in the U.S. had been breached. Later estimates have indicated it's closer to 240-some thousand, so that if you have a Social Security number in the United States, you have probably been part of the data breach. So hopefully you're taking appropriate measures to protect yourself, but this is a pretty upsetting situation, I think, for all of us. There's also recently been reported a breach of Deloitte, a breach of Accenture, and a breach of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So data breaches are becoming a big thing in the news. And along with that, forgive me, there are some regulations going into effect that are going to impact companies' management of data and impact what they need to do to protect private data. One of those is the GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. It applies to any company that does business in the European Union with a citizen of the European Union. Actually, whether or not that citizen is actually physically in the European Union. So this will hit a lot of American companies. We're told that up to 70% of the companies will not be prepared to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation by May 25th, when it actually goes into effect. Sorry. Fines for non-compliance with the GDPR can go up to 4% of your international or global revenue, or a maximum of 20 million euro. So when a company is making its risk management decisions, that is likely going to factor into how much time and attention they want to spend on citizens of the European Union with whom they do business. There's also a regulation going into effect in New York State. It goes into effect in January of 2018. And it is called New York's 23 NCRR Part 500. I grew up in New York, and we like to name things in an incomprehensible way. But basically, it covers any financial institution, including insurance companies, that do business in New York State, as long as they're above a certain size, and the above a certain size is a pretty small limit. This regulation is much more specific about the kinds of cyber protection that you need to apply for your data and for your customers. It covers data in transit and also data at rest. It requires encryption and multi-factor authentication. And you might be surprised to learn that there are a non-trivial percentage of companies who are not yet using multi-factor authentication. It requires an annual certification. I believe this first certification is due in February of 2018. And it also covers third-party and vendor services. So not only does your company need to comply with this, but you need to make sure that other companies handling your data comply with this regulation. That's also true of the General Data Protection Regulation for the European Union. The companies that do the business are called the processors. No, I'm going to get the terms wrong. But if you do the business, you're responsible for complying. And if you do business for the company that does business with the European citizen, you're also responsible for complying. So now not only do we have to worry about ourselves, we have to worry about our vendors. And incident reporting in the New York reg has to occur within 72 hours of identification that there has been an incident, which in the case of Equifax would have been hugely missed. And these regulations are only the beginning of what is likely to happen in the privacy and personal information protection space. So what is personal data? In general, personal data is any data that can be used to identify a particular individual. And in the GDPR, the definition is, and I am going to read this to you because I doubt you can read it, and it's critical, the list of things that can be personally identifiable identifiers. Personal data means any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, a data subject. A natural person is anybody who's a human being who's not an LLC or a corporation or a DBA. An identifiable natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly, in particular by reference to an identifier, such as name, an identification number, location data, an online identifier, or to one or more factors specific to the physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social identity of that natural person. I saw at least one person say, wow. I hope you're all thinking wow, unless you're intimately familiar with this regulation. I wrote an article in 1999 for the Journal of Data Warehousing that talked about how can personal information, how can you be identified? And in that article, I talked about a 9-digit zip code and a gender. Now, a 9-digit zip code identifies a single-family home. If you live in a single-family home, you have your own unique 9-digit zip code. In the case, you wouldn't think about zip code being, all that specific, but it is. And in our single-family home, where there are 2 adults, one is female, one is male. So if an organization knows my 9-digit zip and my gender, they know me. So those are the kinds of combinations of data that we're going to have to worry about going forward as we do big data things or even little data things. So who owns personal data? In Europe, it's very clear. The European perspective is that the consumer owns their own personal data. They, under GDPR, will have the right to be forgotten. In other words, if I've done business with a company and I don't want to do business with them any longer and I don't want them to keep my data, the company will be required to purge my data. I also have to give informed consent to the use of my data. And right now, informed consent is considered to be something like the acceptance of cookies, or I read the 4,000-page, 0.6 font agreement. That's not going to be true going forward under GDPR. It's going to have to be very well-informed consent. In the United States, we believe that all of the data that we collect belongs to us as a company. And there's an inherent conflict in those 2 points of view. And we predict that over time, the US concept of data ownership will evolve to be much more like the European concept of data ownership. So I think it's time to be aware. First of all, compliance with these regulations and others to follow will never be one and done. That's a theme you've heard in almost every presentation today. And that is true. It's not like other regulations where you can comply and then you're done and you don't really have to worry about it anymore. Because means of identifying people will evolve, technology will evolve, and perspectives on personal information will evolve. So companies, many of them have no choice but to do things differently than they do them today. So what's the good and the bad and the ugly about all of this? It's not all bad. In fact, it may be a very good thing for companies because these kinds of regulations and perspectives on data and personal information are going to move companies to behave in a manner that probably we all should have been behaving in all along. The good is you can use the compliance with things like GDPR and the New York Financial Services Regulation as a pathway to best practices. And what is one of the things you often run into trouble with management when you're trying to implement something of this nature? Is there going to be an ROI? We heard that earlier today. What's it going to cost? What's the value of what you're going to do? Well, with GDPR, the ROI should be fairly easy to establish. So you can actually use these regulations as drivers to get funding to do what you need to do. Probably more important is that reputational risk is going to be huge in connection with events that might occur as a result of noncompliance, Equifax being the shining example right now. The best way to ensure ongoing compliance is to institute a robust data governance process. And the governance process doesn't have to be completely entangled. It doesn't have to be overwhelming in terms of time to implement, but it should begin to think about privacy at the very beginning of every use of data and of every project. It shouldn't be something like security that often gets tacked on at the end. Privacy and security should be a going-in standard for any project. If you can treat your customers' data with care, the customer service experience is going to be better, the customer is going to like you better, and you're going to have a competitive advantage. So in that sense, it's all good. And you have the opportunity to build privacy by design into everything that you do. Privacy by design is described in great detail in Article 25 of GDPR. If you're really bored and having trouble sleeping and you don't have a medical device on your phone that can put you to sleep. But basically, privacy by design means that you build in privacy from the very start of any effort, any big data effort, any project effort. What's the bad? Potential fines can be huge. Reputational risk is non-trivial. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think a lot of organizations kind of hope that, for example, they'll never get hacked. And the only kind of organization that has never been hacked is one that doesn't know it hasn't been hacked. Or doesn't know it has been hacked, sorry. The path to compliance is going to be different for every company. So there isn't one tool, there isn't one in-a-box solution for ensuring privacy protection. You have to have a company-wide approach to how you're going to address these issues because every company is different, every company's use of data is different, and the data that's collected is different. Deadlines are tight, and we're told that 70% of impacted companies have not started or are behind in terms of implementation, and this is for GDPR. The ugly, compliance will require process, data, and cybersecurity changes, and you've heard this repeatedly all day, and I'm so glad, because unless companies document their processes, identify their data, understand its value, they are not going to be able to comply on an ongoing basis. The money spent may be non-trivial, but it will be money well spent. And staff training on an ongoing basis will be essential because what your staff does can end up being a violation of one of these regulations. So it's not just, there's not just an automated solution. You need a process and educational solution as well. So RG, we're a consulting firm. We're headquartered out of Alexandria, Virginia. And we have had a process. It's trademarked. It's called Link Process. And it's a process that melds beautifully with what you need to do in order to discover how to become compliant with these regulations, and also how to data govern in an intelligent and efficient fashion. So we've got, you can't read it, but it says discovery, remediation and process improvement, audit control, customer satisfaction measures. And as a result of going through this cycle, you've got not only compliance, but you've got delighted customers, which is really the thing you want to go for. Compliance hopefully will just be a byproduct. This is a more detailed, nope, it's not yet a more detailed look. What do you need to do? You need to understand your data landscape. How do you use data? What data do you collect for what purposes? Because GDPR requires fit-for-purpose use of data, so you can't just collect things like my hair color and my vision prescription unless you have a need for it. Every company's data is different. There's no package solution. You have to have a robust risk management framework. And I think that was first mentioned at lunchtime and hasn't been mentioned earlier, but risk management is going to be absolutely crucial to choosing your priorities, spending your money wisely, and understanding where you are in fact at risk. You have to understand and document your business processes, data, and policy. As much as everyone hates that, both regulations require it, and it's not something you can do at the last minute, and you did hear that again earlier today. You need to educate your staff, and there are no true experts right now because the regulations are not yet in place. But you know your business, so you have the biggest foundation for doing this correctly. And this is a little more detail on our Discovery Link process, and I think I'm in under the wire in case you have any questions. Yes?
Does this say that?
Sorry.
That any piece of data that you have about me, I could say, I don't want you to have anymore?
If you're in Europe, yes.
So I could go and say, my bank accounts, I want all my banking transactions deleted, I want all my all my medical records deleted. I basically vanished from the face of the earth by just saying I want everything about me deleted.
Well, you may not want to say that, obviously, but you have the right to be forgotten. You also, under GDPR, and I'm not a GDPR expert, believe me, nor am I an attorney, nor do I have any desire to be. But under GDPR, you can ask to have your, for example, your medical data, you can ask to have it transferred to another provider, and you can ask to have it removed from your previous provider. So that's an example of what you might be able to have done. And there are, I mean, when you talk about blockchain, there are some issues in terms of erasure of data. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
So this is the exact opposite of what we're doing with big data.
Yes.
If you say everything about me is no longer available to you,
Correct.
the big data model is multiple.
And you have some alternatives like anonymization or pseudo-anonymization, which I can't really pronounce. But
if you de-identify, is that good enough, or not? Because de-identify.
Again, I'm not a GDPR expert, so I can't answer that question. But my intuition tells me that yes, if you can identify me and I don't want you to have your data, or you want you to have my data, and I'm a citizen of the EU, then you need to do something about it. That's my 18-minute warning. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.